The bunker had been empty for 12 years, so when something knocked from the other side, every man standing in the rain forgot how to breathe. It was the fourth night after Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks disappeared, and Camp Calder lay beneath a coastal storm that had swallowed the moon, drowned the roads in black water, and turned the abandoned northern range into a wilderness of wind and rust. At 11:17 p.m., Corporal Mason Hale saw the white K9 again. Ghost sat before the sealed entrance of Bunker B-17, exactly where he had waited the 3 nights before, his pale coat glowing beneath the weak yellow security light like a small piece of winter left behind in the Carolina rain. Water streamed from the tips of his ears. Mud darkened his paws. He did not shiver. He did not bark. He only stared at the steel door as though someone he loved were standing just beyond it. Mason tightened his rain jacket and crossed the final 50 feet of cracked pavement, his flashlight trembling slightly in the wind. He had been ordered to return Ghost to the kennels if the dog appeared again. Captain Hayes believed the animal was confused by grief. The search teams had spent nearly 72 hours combing the marshes, service roads, and pine woods surrounding the base, but Ghost refused to follow them. Every night, he escaped his enclosure. Every night, he returned here. "Come on, boy," Mason said, keeping his voice low. "You can't keep doing this." Ghost did not turn. His ears remained angled toward the bunker. Mason clipped the leash to his collar and gave it a careful pull. The dog resisted without growling, lowering his body until his chest nearly touched the wet concrete. There was no panic in him, only certainty. Mason looked at the door. B-17 had been built during the Cold War and permanently closed after flooding damaged its lower chambers. 2 steel bars crossed the entrance. A chain as thick as Mason's wrist ran through the handles, secured by a weathered military lock. A red warning sign hung crooked against the metal, its letters faded but still readable. No entry. Structure condemned. The engineering report said there were no active power lines inside, no working ventilation, and no accessible rooms beyond the first corridor. Nothing lived there except mold, insects, and old echoes. Ghost leaned forward and pressed his nose to the narrow seam beneath the door. His breathing changed. One slow inhale, then another. His tail remained still, but a faint sound rose in his throat, not quite a whine. More like a question he had been asking for 4 nights and could no longer understand why no one answered. Mason crouched beside him. Up close, he could see how tired the dog was. Red veins traced the whites of his amber eyes. A small patch of fur beneath his collar had been rubbed thin from repeated attempts to escape. Someone had placed food near the bunker earlier that evening, but the bowl sat untouched beneath the security lamp, rainwater filling it to the rim. "Isaiah isn't in there," Mason whispered, though the words sounded weak the moment they left him. Ghost finally looked at him. For one brief second, Mason felt as if the dog were not asking for comfort. He was asking to be believed. Then Ghost turned back to the door. He lifted his right paw and touched the steel once. The sound was soft beneath the storm. Tap. He waited. Rain drummed against the bunker roof. Wind moved through the tall grass. Ghost touched the door again. Tap. Mason stopped breathing. The dog raised his paw a 3rd time. Tap. Then he lowered it and sat perfectly still. 5 seconds passed. Perhaps 6. Mason began to rise, telling himself it was only a habit, some fragment of training between a missing Marine and his dog. Then the storm seemed to pause. From somewhere beyond the chain door came a sound, so faint Mason almost mistook it for water moving through a pipe. Knock. He froze. Ghost's ears rose. A second knock followed, slower than the first. Then a third. 3 deliberate sounds from inside a bunker that had been locked for 12 years. Mason's flashlight slipped from his hand and struck the pavement, its beam spinning across the rain before coming to rest on Ghost. The white K9 did not flinch. He simply lowered himself beside the door, placed his head between his paws, and waited for the person inside to knock again. 6 months earlier, before the rain and the locked door and the silence that would divide the base, 3 taps had meant something simple. At dawn, Camp Calder smelled of wet pine, salt drifting in from the Carolina coast, and coffee carried through the open doors of the K9 building. Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks stood outside Ghost's kennel with one hand resting against the metal frame. He was 36, tall and broad through the shoulders, with deep brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and steady eyes that rarely revealed how much he noticed. A faded scar crossed the back of his left hand, but his movements were gentle whenever he reached for the white German shepherd waiting inside. Ghost sat with perfect discipline, his pale coat clean against the gray concrete, amber eyes fixed on Isaiah. He did not move when the latch opened. He waited for the signal. Isaiah lifted 2 fingers and tapped the kennel door 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Ghost's ears rose. Only then did Isaiah open the gate. "Morning, partner," he said. Ghost stepped forward and pressed his shoulder against Isaiah's leg for half a second, a quiet greeting that no training manual had taught him. Nearby, Corporal Mason Hale was stacking equipment beside the wall. He watched the exchange and smiled. "You know he can hear the latch," Mason said. "You do not need to knock." Isaiah clipped the lead to Ghost's collar. "The knock is not for his ears." Mason looked at him. "What is it for?" Isaiah glanced down at the dog. "So he knows I am there." They walked into the cool morning, boots and paws moving together across the gravel. The base was waking around them. Trucks rolled toward the motor pool. A flag snapped above headquarters. Somewhere beyond the eastern fence, gulls cried over the marsh. Isaiah led Ghost to the training field, where rows of wooden barriers and empty vehicles stood under a pale sky. Their work that morning was ordinary. Search patterns, scent recognition, silent direction. Ghost moved with calm precision, never wasting a step. When Isaiah pointed, the dog followed. When Isaiah stopped, Ghost stopped. There was no strain between command and obedience. It looked less like control and more like conversation. Captain Rebecca Hayes watched from the edge of the field with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "He reads you before you give the signal," she said. Isaiah offered a small smile. "He has learned my bad habits. Or your good ones." Ghost completed the exercise and returned to Isaiah's left side. Isaiah knelt, rubbed the thick fur beneath the dog's neck, and whispered, "Good work." Ghost's tail touched the ground once. That was enough. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Mason found Isaiah sitting on a bench behind the K9 building. Ghost lay at his boots with his eyes half closed. The 3 taps still bothered Mason, not because they seemed strange, but because Isaiah had spoken them with the weight of an old memory. "You never answered me," Mason said. Isaiah looked toward the distant tree line. For a while, he said nothing. Then he rested both hands on his knees. "When I was 9 years old, a storm knocked out the power in our neighborhood outside Fayetteville. I got trapped in my father's storage cellar when the door jammed." Mason sat beside him. Isaiah continued in the same quiet voice. "It was completely dark. No windows. No light under the door. I kept calling, but the rain was too loud. After a while, I stopped because I thought nobody could hear me." Ghost lifted his head. Isaiah reached down and touched the dog's ear. "Then my father found the cellar. Before he opened it, he knocked 3 times. He told me, 'I am here. You are not alone.'" Mason's expression softened. "So you kept it. Some things are worth keeping." From that day forward, the signal followed Isaiah and Ghost everywhere. 3 taps against the side of a transport vehicle before a training run. 3 taps on the wall outside the veterinary room. 3 taps on a wooden door before a night patrol. It became a promise without ceremony, repeated so often that no one else noticed it anymore. But Ghost always did. On the last evening before Isaiah disappeared, fog drifted low across the northern range, turning the security lights into pale circles. Isaiah and Ghost followed the service road toward the abandoned section of Camp Calder. Their assignment was routine: inspect a damaged fence line and return before midnight. The air was unusually still. Even the marsh insects had gone quiet. As they passed the old concrete rise above Bunker B-17, Ghost stopped. His body stiffened. His nose lifted toward the darkness. Isaiah followed his gaze to a narrow ventilation grate half hidden beneath vines and pine needles. A faint metallic sound traveled through it, too measured to be water and too soft to be machinery. Ghost stepped closer. Isaiah raised his radio. "Calder Command, this is Brooks. I have an unidentified sound near the northern bunker." Static answered. Then, from somewhere beneath the ground, something knocked once. Isaiah held the radio closer, but only a dry ribbon of static moved through the speaker. Ghost stood beside the hidden ventilation grate, his white coat almost silver beneath the security light, every muscle quiet and alert. The sound did not come again. For several seconds, The northern range seemed to hold its breath. Isaiah crouched and cleared away the wet pine needles with one gloved hand. The grate was older than the bunker entrance, its edges furred with rust, its bolts buried beneath years of dirt. A current of cool air touched his face. Beneath the scent of damp concrete and old metal was something else. Faint. Human. Ghost lowered his nose to the opening and inhaled slowly. Then he looked at Isaiah. "You smell it too," Isaiah murmured. He tried the radio again. Calder command. "This is Staff Sergeant Brooks at Bunker B-17. Possible unauthorized access below the northern range. Requesting engineering support." Static answered once more, followed by a broken fragment of a voice too weak to understand. Isaiah checked the signal indicator. Nothing. The fog had thickened over the service road, and the nearest working communications post was nearly half a mile south. He should have returned and reported the discovery in person. Procedure was clear. Yet Ghost had begun moving along the concrete rise, nose close to the ground, following an invisible path around the bunker's eastern wall. Isaiah followed. 20 yards beyond the sealed entrance, the dog stopped beside a narrow maintenance door almost completely. Hidden by ivy. The faded lettering on the steel read "Auxiliary Access." Isaiah had passed the door many times without noticing it. It did not appear on the modern map stored on his field tablet. He pulled the vines aside and found an electronic panel mounted beside the frame. To his surprise, a single green light still glowed. "That should not have power," he said. Ghost watched the scene beneath the door. Isaiah entered his identification code. The panel gave a low tone, and the lock released with a heavy internal click. He opened the door only a few inches. A breath of cold, stale air escaped from the darkness, carrying the mineral smell of underground water. Isaiah switched on his flashlight. A concrete stairway descended steeply into the bunker, disappearing after 30 feet. Emergency lights along the wall flickered awake one by one, dim amber circles leading downward. Ghost stepped forward, but Isaiah placed a hand against his chest. "Easy." The dog's ears moved toward the lower corridor. Somewhere beneath them, metal scraped softly against metal. Isaiah pressed the transmit button again. "Command, Brooks. I have located an unlisted access point on the east side of B-17. I am conducting a visual check only." The radio remained silent. He considered closing the door and waiting for support. Then Ghost gave one low whine and stared into the stairwell with an urgency Isaiah had learned never to dismiss. Isaiah loosened the lead and entered. Their footsteps echoed in the narrow passage. Water ticked from overhead pipes. Dust lay thick on the stairs, but near the bottom, Ghost found a broken line through it, as though something had recently been dragged across the floor. Isaiah swept his light over the marks. They led toward a short corridor ending at another reinforced door. An old service sign beside it read "Lower Communications." Ghost moved ahead, pulling gently now. Isaiah reached for the handle. The instant his fingers touched it, every emergency light went dark. A deep mechanical sound rolled through the walls. Behind them, the auxiliary door began to close. Ghost back. Isaiah turned and ran toward the stairs. The dog reached the threshold first, but the heavy steel door was already descending into its frame. Isaiah pushed Ghost through the narrowing gap and released the lead. "Go." Ghost landed outside as the door continued closing. He spun immediately, trying to force his nose back through the opening. Isaiah braced both hands against the steel, but the old mechanism moved with steady, unstoppable weight. "Stay back, Ghost." The gap narrowed to inches. The dog's amber eyes met his. Isaiah struck the inside of the door 3 times with his palm. Tap, tap, tap. "I am here," he said. "You are not alone." Then the door sealed, dividing them with a final metallic thud. Darkness returned. Isaiah lifted his flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. Somewhere deeper in the bunker, a ventilation fan groaned into motion. Ghost remained outside, staring at the closed door. He scratched once at the steel, then lifted his paw and answered with 3 careful taps. Before Isaiah could respond, a second mechanism shifted beneath the floor. The concrete trembled. A hidden panel opened behind him, releasing a rush of cold air from a passage that did not exist on any map. His radio slipped from his hand, skidded across the floor, and vanished through the opening. Isaiah stepped back, but the service door beside him suddenly swung inward. The floor tilted beneath his boots, guiding him into the dark lower corridor as the panel closed again. Outside, Ghost began to bark. Security cameras recorded the dog circling the auxiliary entrance for 11 minutes. Then the power returned. The door opened by itself. The corridor beyond was empty. Isaiah Brooks was gone. Ghost did not leave the auxiliary door until Captain Rebecca Hayes arrived with 2 security teams and an engineering officer. By then, the fog had settled so heavily across the northern range that the flashlights looked like pale tunnels cut through milk. Ghost stood with his chest against the steel, breathing hard, his ears fixed on the darkness beyond. Mason Hale reached him first. "Where is Staff Sergeant Brooks?" he asked, though he already knew the dog could not answer. Ghost turned once toward the open corridor, then back to Mason, and gave 3 sharp taps against the threshold with his paw. Inside, the passage was empty. The dust on the stairs carried Isaiah's footprints down to the lower level, but they ended beside a blank concrete wall. His radio signal appeared for less than a second near the eastern marsh, almost half a mile away, then vanished. Captain Hayes ordered the bunker sealed and began a full search of the surrounding grounds. For the next 12 hours, Marines moved through wet pine woods, drainage ditches, maintenance roads, and low marshland where reeds bent beneath the coastal wind. They found Isaiah's radio near a shallow culvert, half covered by mud. They found no sign of Isaiah. Search dogs were brought in from another unit, and Ghost was expected to lead them. Instead, he pulled away from every trail that pointed toward the marsh. Each time a handler redirected him, he turned north, back toward Bunker B-17. "He is confused," one of the handlers said. "He lost the scent at the door and keeps returning to the last place he saw him." Mason watched Ghost strain against the lead, his amber eyes fixed on the distant concrete rise. "That is not confusion," Mason said. "He is trying to tell us something." Captain Hayes heard him, but grief did not excuse disobedience, even in a dog. She ordered Ghost return to the K9 building while the search continued. The first night, at exactly 11:17, the kennel alarm sounded. Ghost had worked the latch loose with his nose and forced his way through the lower gate. Security cameras followed his white shape crossing the sleeping base, moving past the motor pool, the empty training field, and the fence line without hesitation. He reached Bunker B-17 and sat before the main entrance. He did not scratch. He did not bark. He simply waited. Mason found him 20 minutes later. Rain had begun to fall in thin silver lines, and Ghost's coat was already darkening with water. "Come on, boy," Mason said, clipping the lead to his collar. Ghost refused to move. Then the base clock reached 11:17. Ghost lifted his paw and touched the door 3 times. Mason heard nothing in return. On the second night, Ghost escaped again. This time, he reached the bunker before the patrol. Vehicle turned onto the northern road. He sat in the same place, at the same angle, facing the same seam beneath the door. At 11:17, he tapped 3 times. The wind pushed through the grass. Somewhere inside the old structure, metal gave a faint creak. Mason told himself it was the temperature changing. On the third night, he arrived early and waited in the shadow of the security tower. Ghost appeared at 11:12, moving slowly now, exhaustion visible in the way his paws dragged across the pavement. He ignored the food Mason had placed nearby. He ignored the blanket. He lowered himself before the door and watched the narrow space at the bottom. Mason finally understood. Ghost was not staring at the bunker entrance. He was watching the darkness beneath it. At 11:17, the dog tapped 3 times. Then he lowered his head until one ear rested almost against the concrete. Mason crouched 10 feet away, afraid that even his breathing might cover whatever Ghost was listening for. Nothing came. Ghost remained there until dawn. By the 4th day, the search around the marsh had widened to 6 miles. Boats crossed the shallow waterways. Patrols checked abandoned buildings beyond the perimeter. Captain Hayes spoke carefully when she addressed the unit, but the silence between her words carried the weight no one wanted to name. Mason kept thinking about Isaiah's old signal. "I am here. You are not alone." That evening, he asked permission to remain near the bunker overnight. Captain Hayes denied the request. "We have engineers checking the structure tomorrow," she said. "Until then, nobody approaches that entrance." "Ghost will." "Then secure him." Mason tried. He checked the kennel himself, tested every latch, and remained nearby until the lights dimmed. At 10:54, a transformer failed on the western side of the building. The corridor went dark for less than a minute. When the lights returned, Ghost was gone. Mason found the rear service gate open and a line of wet paw prints leading north. He followed them through rising wind and rain until the bunker appeared beyond the trees. Ghost was already there. He sat before the chained door, still as stone, waiting for 11:17. Mason moved closer and saw that the dog was not looking forward anymore. His gaze was fixed on the thin line where the steel met the ground. Then Ghost pressed his nose to the gap and inhaled. His body trembled once. Not from cold, from recognition. Ghost kept his nose pressed to the narrow seam until Mason heard the faint change in his breathing. It was not the sharp, searching pattern of a dog following a distant trail. It was slower, deeper, certain. Mason knelt beside him and placed one hand on the wet concrete. A thread of warm air moved beneath the steel door, so slight he might have missed it if the night had not been cold. It carried the smell of rust, standing water, and something Ghost knew before any human could name it. At sunrise, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Mercer arrived with 2 engineers, a thermal scanner, and a folder of modern bunker plans. Mercer was 51, narrow-faced, careful with his words, and known for trusting measurements more than instincts. He studied Ghost briefly, then turned toward the entrance. "This structure has been inactive for 12 years, he said. "No electrical service, no ventilation, no usable lower level." Mason looked down at the white K9 sitting beside the door, then explained the warm air. Mercer checked the seam with a handheld sensor. The display flickered, then settled. Temperature difference from groundwater. Old concrete holds heat. Captain Hayes stood beneath the awning of the patrol vehicle, her expression unreadable. She had not slept. None of them had. "Open it," she ordered. The chain came away with a metallic groan. Mercer and his team entered first, their flashlights sweeping across stained walls and silent equipment. Mason followed with Ghost on a short lead. The main corridor smelled of damp stone and dust. Water had collected in shallow pools along the floor. Old communication panels lined one wall, their switches frozen beneath grime. Ghost moved carefully, nose low, then stopped at the eastern side of the bunker. He faced a blank concrete wall. Mercer checked the plans. Nothing behind that. Ghost touched the floor with one paw. Mason watched his ears angle forward. "He says there is." Mercer used the thermal scanner across the wall. No heat signature appeared. A sound sensor detected only water moving through buried pipes. They checked the auxiliary corridor where Isaiah had vanished, but the floor panel remained sealed and the mechanism refused to respond. After 2 hours, Mercer returned to Captain Hayes. "The bunker is empty," he said. "There is no chamber beneath the eastern section. The plans show solid foundation from here to bedrock." Mason felt Ghost's lead tighten. The dog was staring toward a low drainage opening near the floor, half hidden behind a collapsed storage rack. "What about that?" Mason asked. Mercer crouched and shone his light through the grate. "Storm runoff. It exits somewhere beyond the east slope." "Is it on the map?" Mercer did not answer immediately. Not clearly. Ghost stepped toward the opening and inhaled. His entire body changed. His tail lifted. His eyes sharpened. A low sound rose in his throat, quiet but urgent. Mason moved the rack aside and bent close to the grate. Cold air touched his cheek, followed by another current that carried a faint human scent mixed with metal and damp cloth. Ghost pressed both front paws against the wall. "Isaiah," Mason whispered. Captain Hayes heard him. "That is enough." Her voice was firm, but tired. "We have searched every accessible section. The marsh operation is still active, and this dog is exhausted. He is being transferred to the regional K9 center this afternoon." Ghost turned toward her as though he understood. Mason stood. "Captain, he found something. He found a drain. He found Isaiah's scent." Hayes looked at the dog, then at the empty corridor. For a moment, the discipline in her face softened. "Or he found what he needed to find because he cannot accept the alternative." The words landed gently, which made them heavier. At 2 o'clock, a transport van arrived. Ghost refused to enter. 2 handlers tried patience, food, and familiar commands. The dog remained beside Mason, watching the northern range. When the side door finally opened, Ghost slipped free of the lead and ran. He crossed the service road, disappeared behind the bunker, and stopped at the eastern slope. where tall grass covered a shallow ditch. Mason followed and found him digging at a rusted drainage outlet no wider than a dinner plate. Warm, stale air moved from the pipe. Ghost lowered his head and breathed in. Then he gave a soft sound Mason had never heard from him before. Not grief, not fear, but recognition so pure it seemed to hurt. Around the outlet, the mud showed 3 long parallel marks. They had been made by the same paw, night after night, as Ghost returned to this exact place and waited for the scent to rise. Mason touched the mud, then looked toward the sealed bunker wall above them. Somewhere beyond concrete, buried plans, and 12 years of forgotten construction, the white K9 had found the one thing every instrument had missed. Isaiah Brooks was still there. By evening, the storm had turned the northern range into a black sweep of rain, wind, and bending pine. Mason stood beside the drainage outlet with Ghost pressed close to his leg, while Captain Hayes and Mercer argued beneath the shelter of a maintenance truck. The transfer van had been dismissed. No one said why. The official search still remained focused on the marsh, but something had shifted after Ghost found the warm air. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt, Mason knew, was sometimes the first honest step toward truth. Mercer returned to the outlet carrying a flexible camera line and a portable monitor. "The pipe narrows after 18 feet, he said. Then it turns beneath the bunker. We cannot see beyond that." Ghost watched the dark opening. "Can air move through it?" Mason asked. "Yes." "Can sound?" Mercer looked at him. "In theory." Captain Hayes stood a few feet away, rain tapping against the brim of her cap. "Then we test it." They placed a microphone near the drain and waited. For 10 minutes, the monitor showed only a thin green line trembling with the wind. Water moved somewhere underground. Metal clicked as the temperature changed. Nothing else. Mercer finally shook his head. "There is no pattern." Ghost remained still. Mason checked his watch. 10:48 p.m. The dog had not eaten. His white coat was heavy with rain, but his eyes stayed fixed on the bunker as if time itself. "We're pulling him toward it." "He is waiting for 11:17, Mason said. Hayes glanced at him. "You are certain?" "He has come here at the same time every night." Mercer folded his arms. "Animals learn routines. That does not prove anyone is alive." Mason looked at Ghost. "No, but it proves he believes someone is listening." Thunder rolled far out over the coast. The security lamps flickered once. Then again, a warning tone sounded from the maintenance truck. Mercer turned toward it just as the entire northern sector went dark. The security lights vanished. The low hum of ventilation units stopped. The portable floodlights died. Even the distant machinery from the motor pool fell silent. For the first time since any of them had arrived, Camp Calder made no sound at all. The darkness felt larger without electricity to hold it back. Rain softened. Wind moved through the grass. Mason could hear Ghost breathing beside him. Then the dog pulled free. "Ghost!" Mason reached for the lead, but the white K9 was already running uphill through the dark. His pale shape moved across the service road, crossed the open concrete apron, and stopped before the chained entrance to Bunker B-17. Mason, Hayes, and Mercer followed with handheld flashlights. Their beams shook over the steel door and the wet ground. Ghost sat directly before the seam. He lowered his head and listened. Mason checked his watch. 11:16, 1 minute passed slowly. No one spoke. At 11:17, Ghost lifted his right paw. Tap. He waited. Tap. His ears rose higher. Tap. The third sound disappeared into the night. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Mercer exhaled and looked away. From somewhere behind the steel came a faint knock. Everyone froze. A second knock followed. Slow. Deliberate. Then a third. Captain Hayes stepped closer to the door. "Do it again," she whispered. Ghost did not move. Mason took the metal end of his flashlight and struck the door 3 times. Knock. 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 Silence answered. Mercer placed one hand against the steel. "The sound is not coming from directly behind this entrance." Mason listened. At first, he heard only rainwater running along the concrete. Then the reply came again, but lower this time, muted by distance. 3 knocks rising through the floor beneath their boots. Hayes turned toward Mercer. "You said there was no room below us." Mercer stared at the plans in his hand, though the darkness made them useless. The digital layout shows foundation and bedrock. Another series came from below. Weaker. 3 knocks. Ghost lowered himself, pressing one ear against the wet ground. Mason knelt beside him and felt a slight vibration beneath his palm. Not pipes. Not water. A rhythm. Human. Mercer's face changed. The certainty left it. The old plans may be incomplete, he said. There were Cold War modifications that never made it into the later records. Hayes lifted her radio, but the power failure had taken the repeater network. How long until backup systems return? Maybe 20 minutes. We do not have 20 minutes. Ghost rose and moved away from the entrance. He crossed the pavement, then stopped at the eastern slope above the drainage pipe. He looked back once, waiting for them to follow. Mason understood first. The sound is traveling through the runoff line. Mercer ran after the dog, sweeping his light across the ground. Ghost traced the buried pipe for 30 yards, then stopped over a patch of concrete hidden beneath weeds and mud. He scratched once. Mercer dropped to his knees and cleared the surface with both hands. Beneath the dirt was the edge of an old maintenance plate with lettering nearly erased by time. Auxiliary lower access. Captain Hayes stared at it. This is not on your map. Mercer shook his head. From beneath the plate came 3 soft knocks, barely more than a tremor now. Ghost placed his paw over the sound. Mason lowered his hand beside it and whispered into the darkness. Isaiah, we are here. For a moment, nothing answered. Then one final knock rose through the concrete. Not 3, just one, faint but unmistakable, like a man who had heard the promise and no longer needed to spend his strength asking whether anyone was coming. Mercer placed both hands on the maintenance plate and studied the worn lettering beneath Mason's flashlight. The metal was nearly hidden beneath. Decades of mud, roots, and hardened sealant. This access point predates the digital plans, he said. Maybe by 50 years. Captain Hayes looked toward the dark base behind them. Emergency power had not returned. Rain moved in thin sheets across the concrete, and the only light came from flashlights and the pale shape of Ghost standing over the buried plate. Then find the original drawings, she said. Mercer hesitated. The archive building is on the south side. Paper records from this section may not even exist. Hayes held his gaze. Find them. While Mercer drove toward the archive, Mason stayed beside Ghost. Every few minutes, the dog lowered his ear to the concrete and waited. The knocking did not return. That silence frightened Mason more than the sound had. Navy Corpsman Emily Carter arrived with a medical kit, blankets, oxygen, and 2 Marines carrying portable cutting equipment. Emily was in her late 30s, calm-eyed and steady, with dark hair pulled beneath a rain cover. She knelt beside the maintenance plate and touched the concrete with her fingertips. How long has he been down there? Almost 4 days, Mason said. Emily looked toward Ghost. Then he has survived cold, dehydration, and darkness longer than most people could. She did not say what else she was thinking. She did not need to. Ghost pressed one paw against the plate. Mason leaned closer. Isaiah, he called. Corporal Hale is here. Captain Hayes is here. Medical is here. We are not leaving. For a moment, only water moved beneath the ground. Then 3 faint taps answered from farther below. Emily closed her eyes briefly, listening. He is conserving energy, she said. Do not ask him to answer unless we need him to guide us. Mercer returned 25 minutes later carrying a long cardboard tube and a leather folder swollen with age. He spread the papers across the hood of the maintenance truck, holding the corners down with tools. The drawings were dated October 1968. Their ink had faded to soft blue, but the lines beneath the northern range were unmistakable. The modern plans showed a single bunker level resting on solid foundation. The older drawing showed something else. A narrow emergency chamber ran below the eastern communications room, connected to a drainage tunnel and a hidden service shaft. Someone had marked the chamber with red pencil and written sealed after flood damage. Mercer traced the line with one finger. The lower room was removed from later records after renovation. They poured concrete over the access, rerouted the drainage, and treated the space as if it no longer existed. Hayes stared at the forgotten chamber. But it still exists. Yes. He turned toward the slope, and Ghost has been standing directly above it. The cutting team cleared the maintenance plate and removed the rusted bolts. Beneath it was not an open shaft, but another layer of reinforced concrete. Mercer tapped the surface and listened. At least 10 inches thick. How long? Hayes asked. If the equipment holds, 40 minutes. Ghost gave a low whine. Mason rested a hand against his neck. They are coming, boy. The first cutting wheel touched concrete, sending a deep vibration through the ground. The sound was not violent, but it was immense, a steady mechanical cry that filled the storm-dark range. Ghost backed away only when Mason asked him to, then lay at the edge of the work lights with his chin on his paws. He never looked anywhere except the opening. Dust mixed with rain and turned to pale paste beneath the Marine's boots. Every 10 minutes, the equipment stopped so Emily could listen. The first time, 3 taps answered. The second time, only 2. The third time, there was 1. Faint. Delayed. Emily looked at Hayes. We need to move faster. Mercer changed the cutting angle and directed the team toward the old service shaft shown on the drawing. The final section of concrete was thinner there, weakened by age and groundwater. Ghost suddenly stood. He crossed the safety line before Mason could stop him and placed his nose against the forming gap. Warm, stale air escaped, carrying the scent he had followed for 4 nights. Ghost inhaled, then released a soft, trembling breath. That is him, Mason said. The Marines widened the opening until Mercer could lower a camera through it. The monitor showed darkness, a rusted ladder, and water shining several feet below. Then the camera turned toward a narrow chamber. A figure lay beside an old metal pipe, partly covered by a fallen canvas curtain. Emily leaned close to the screen. I see movement. Hayes stepped forward. Isaiah, this is Captain Hayes. We found you. No answer came through the opening. The team removed the last section of concrete and cleared the shaft. Emily prepared to descend first, but Ghost pressed toward the gap, every part of him drawn to the darkness below. Mason held his collar gently. Not yet. The ladder groaned beneath Mercer's weight as he climbed down, followed by Emily and 1 rescue Marine. Their flashlights moved across the underground chamber, making the old walls appear and disappear. Mason waited above with Ghost, listening for a voice, a command, anything. Seconds stretched. Then Emily called from below. We found him. Ghost surged forward, but Mason held him close. Is he conscious? Hayes asked. A pause followed. Too long. Emily's voice returned, quieter now. He is alive. The words moved through the group like warmth. Mason bent over Ghost and pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's wet fur. Below, the rescue team prepared the stretcher. Ghost stood at the opening, ears lifted, waiting for the sound that had guided him through 4 nights. But from the hidden chamber, no more knocking came. The rescue team moved with the quiet urgency of people who knew that every second mattered, yet none of them rushed carelessly. Emily Carter knelt beside Isaiah in the narrow chamber, checking his breathing, speaking his name in a steady voice, and guiding a small stream of oxygen beneath his nose. His uniform was damp with condensation, his face pale beneath the dust, but when she touched his shoulder, his eyelids moved. Staff Sergeant Brooks, you are not alone, she said. The words traveled upward through the shaft, and Ghost heard them. His entire body tightened. Mason felt the dog pull toward the opening with a strength that did not come from panic. It came from recognition. Easy, Ghost, Mason whispered. They have him. Below, Mercer cleared old cables and broken storage panels from the path while the rescue Marine secured Isaiah to the stretcher. The chamber was smaller than the drawings suggested, no more than 12 feet across, with rusted communication equipment along one wall and a drainage channel cutting through the floor. Near Isaiah's right hand lay a bent section of metal pipe. 3 shallow marks darkened its surface where his fingers had struck it again and again. Emily noticed them as she adjusted the blanket over him. This is how he reached us, she said. Mercer followed the pipe with his flashlight. It disappeared into the wall, joining the same runoff system Ghost had found outside. The sound traveled through the drainage line, he said. The bunker itself carried it. Above them, Ghost gave 1 soft whine. Isaiah's eyes opened slightly. The sound was barely audible through the shaft, but his head turned toward it. His lips moved. Emily leaned closer. What did you say? Isaiah tried again. Ghost. The dog heard his name. He stepped onto the edge of the opening and lowered his head, searching the darkness. Mason looked at Captain Hayes. She gave 1 small nod. Let him down carefully. Mercer secured a safety harness around Ghost's chest, and Mason descended the ladder beside him. The white K9 touched the chamber floor and immediately pulled free of Mason's guiding hand. He crossed the wet concrete without hesitation and stopped beside the stretcher. For the first time in 4 days, Ghost seemed uncertain. He stood with his ears lowered, staring at Isaiah as if afraid the man before him might disappear again. Isaiah slowly lifted one hand. His fingers trembled, but Ghost moved closer until they touched the thick fur along his cheek. The dog closed his eyes. No bark came. No burst of movement. Only a long breath leaving his body, as though he had been holding it since the steel door closed between them. Then Ghost raised his right paw and rested it gently against Isaiah's chest. Once. He lifted it and touched him again. Twice. A third time. Isaiah's eyes opened wider. The faintest smile crossed his face. "I heard you," he whispered. Ghost lowered his head beside Isaiah's shoulder. Emily looked at the marked pipe, then at the dog. "You were knocking to call him?" she asked. Isaiah gathered enough breath to answer. "No." His voice was weak, but the meaning carried clearly through the chamber. "I was not calling for him. I was answering him." Mason stared at him. Isaiah's hand remained buried in Ghost's wet white fur. "Every night," Isaiah continued, pausing between the words, he tapped first. "I knew he was outside. I knew he had not left." Captain Hayes had climbed halfway down the ladder. She stopped there, one hand gripping the rail. "The search teams never heard it," she said. Isaiah looked toward the pipe. The generators covered the sound. The fans. The rain. But Ghost knew when to listen. Mason remembered the dog arriving at the same time each night, refusing food, lowering one ear to the concrete. He had not been waiting without hope. He had been keeping an appointment. Emily checked Isaiah's pulse again and signaled that they needed to move. The stretcher was raised slowly through the shaft. Ghost stayed beside it until the narrow opening forced him to climb ahead. When Isaiah reached the surface, rain touched his face for the first time in 4 days. Emergency lights had begun returning across the base, one pale row at a time, but the northern range no longer felt dark. Marines gathered in silence around the opening, making room as Emily guided the stretcher toward the waiting medical vehicle. Ghost walked beside Isaiah's right hand. Even when the wheels crossed rough pavement, the dog matched every movement. Captain Hayes followed, her eyes fixed on the pair. "We searched 6 miles of marsh," she said quietly to Mercer. He searched one door. Mercer folded the old plans beneath his arm. He was not searching. They both looked at Ghost. The white K9 paused when Isaiah's hand slipped from the edge of the stretcher. He nudged it gently back into place, then continued walking. "He already knew," Mercer said. Inside the medical vehicle, Emily made space near Isaiah's feet. Ghost climbed in and settled beneath the stretcher, his body finally giving way to exhaustion. Isaiah lowered his hand until his fingers touched the dog's head. Before the doors closed, Mason heard him tap 3 times against the metal rail. Ghost's tail moved once against the floor. The answer was enough. The medical vehicle reached the base hospital just before dawn, carrying Isaiah Brooks beneath warm blankets and Ghost beneath the stretcher, where the white German Shepherd remained so still that Emily Carter checked twice to make sure he was breathing comfortably. For 4 nights, Ghost had refused rest, food, and every command that tried to take him away from the bunker. Now, with Isaiah's hand hanging close enough to touch the fur between his ears, the dog finally closed his eyes. The hospital staff moved Isaiah into a quiet recovery room while the storm weakened beyond the windows. Rain became a soft tapping against the glass. The sky over Camp Calder changed from black to deep blue, then slowly opened into gray. Ghost followed until a nurse stopped him at the doorway. He stood there without protest, looking past her toward the bed. Captain Hayes arrived a moment later and spoke quietly with the hospital administrator. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. A few minutes later, a folded blanket was placed beside Isaiah's bed, and Ghost walked in. He circled once, lowered himself onto the floor, and rested his head across Isaiah's boots. Then he slept. Mason visited that afternoon and found the room filled with pale sunlight. Isaiah was awake, though tired, and a cup of water sat untouched near his hand. Ghost remained asleep beneath him. "He has not moved in 6 hours," Mason said. Isaiah looked down at his partner. "He moved enough for both of us." Mason pulled a chair closer. For a while, neither man spoke. The machines beside the bed hummed softly. Somewhere in the hallway, a cart rolled past and faded into silence. "We thought he was grieving," Mason finally said. We thought he kept returning because he could not understand you were gone. Isaiah ran his fingers through Ghost's white fur. He understood better than anyone. Mason looked toward the rain-washed window. Captain Hayes says the lower chamber will be sealed properly after the investigation. Good. Mercer also found out why the old door opened. A damaged relay received power during the outage. Wrong place. Wrong time. Isaiah considered that. Maybe. Mason smiled faintly. You do not sound convinced. Isaiah looked at Ghost. A broken relay explains how I got inside. It does not explain why he came back at the same minute every night. 3 weeks later, Isaiah returned to Camp Calder on light duty. The morning was clear and cool, with the scent of salt carried inland from the coast. He walked slowly, but he walked without assistance. Ghost stayed at his left side, matching every step. Marines paused as they crossed the base. Some offered quiet greetings. Others simply placed a hand over their hearts or nodded toward the dog. Ghost accepted none of the attention. His eyes remained on Isaiah. They followed the northern service road toward the old bunker, where new fencing now surrounded the eastern slope. Mercer had reinforced the forgotten chamber and recovered every paper record connected to it. The main steel door had been cleaned, but Isaiah had asked that 3 narrow marks near the bottom remain untouched. They were the places where Ghost's paw had met the metal night after night. Beside them, a small brass plaque had been mounted into the concrete. It read, "Some signals are heard only by those who refuse to leave." Mason and Captain Hayes waited several yards away, giving them the space the moment deserved. Isaiah stopped before the door. Ghost sat beside him. For a few seconds, the old bunker was only concrete, steel, and memory. Then Isaiah raised his hand and tapped the door 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Ghost's ears lifted. He looked up at Isaiah, amber eyes bright in the morning light. Isaiah knelt and rested one hand against the dog's neck. "I am here," he whispered. "You are not alone." Ghost leaned forward until his forehead touched Isaiah's chest. There was no crowd close enough to hear the words. No ceremony. No music. Only the wind moving softly through the pine trees and the distant call of gulls above the marsh. Isaiah stood again, and together they turned away from the bunker. Their shadows stretched across the wet pavement, one tall and one moving on 4 steady paws. Behind them, sunlight rested on the 3 marks in the steel. Perhaps what saved Isaiah had been training. Perhaps it had been scent, memory, and the extraordinary patience of a loyal dog. Or perhaps grace sometimes arrives without thunder, waits quietly outside a locked door, and keeps returning until someone finally learns how to listen.